Welcome to the umpteenth meeting of the Tax Abatement and Study and Formulating Committee. We have with us today Dr. Kyle Wiedberg from GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association, who has kindly agreed to sort of guide us through a process of looking at other cities' best practices in the framework of kind of the big picture. We've talked a whole lot about all the different kinds of tax abatements and come up with general principles for recommendations for how we think we can do those better in terms of each individual type that we've learned about. And kind of the one big question remaining was how do we look at these in aggregate and decide as a city if we've hit a limit or if there is no limit, or what parameters we need to be thinking about as we try to evaluate that. So I will turn it over to you. We have handouts.
Yeah, so I put a presentation together, but they said there was no projection, so we'll just go through it analog versus digital, I guess. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Go ahead and pass.
All right, we'll do.
A couple of things. I'm with GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association of America. It's been around for over 100 years. We have about 25,000 members, U.S. and Canada, from all levels of government, everything from budget to finance. Talia has been a longtime member. We have another longtime esteemed member in Eugene. Erica Gilmore is serving on the committee that I help lead for GFOA, which is Community Economic Development and Capital Planning. So we have representation from Metro government in our work. And so I say all that to say, and I did a little presentation with finance earlier today, that this work is part of a national network. And when I'm saying best practices to you, it's not what I think. But rather, that Community Economic Development Capital Planning Committee is made up of 25 people from around the country, and that committee has existed for decades. And so that group is the group that is formulating from their experiences and their work the best practices for governments across the country. So just quickly in the presentation, I am not just from GFOA, I'm a longtime practitioner. I was in the budget office for the city of Chicago, was Deputy CFO of the Philadelphia Public Schools, was Chief Administrative Officer for the Recovery School District down New Orleans after the storm, ran a state agency in Louisiana for about 14 years. I also have degrees. I have a public degree in public administration from University of Massachusetts Amherst and a PhD in public policy from Southern University and A&M College in Baton Rouge. So I think of this from both the practitioner and the academic side. So I am someone who has a lot of experience of work in government, but I'm a generalist. And in saying that, if one of you or if Bob wants to start to really push down into something, I am going to at a moment say that's actually more and farther and a different place than I am comfortable going. And who and what y'all are the experts on Nashville. So that is the place where I completely defer to you, because in this presentation you can say, that's really nice, Kyle, but that's not how this works in Nashville. Here's how it works in Nashville. And you know what? You'll be right, because you are the experts. And so I'm here to have a dialogue with you and bring national perspective and macro perspective and marry it with what you guys do. And that's what we'll do together. All right, so the discussion, I put the bullet points in here of what we're going to talk theory of government's management process, our best practices, look at some other governments, and then make some policy recommendations. And I'm going to try and get through this relatively quickly so that we can have time to have a conversation. We've been able to talk a little bit today with finance and the councilperson and I've been able to talk. So I would love to hear from this group. So on page 4, I have a question for you. I want to start with your feedback. For what reason does Nashville give tax incentives and abatements? You guys have been talking about this. I'd like to hear from you. Why do you all do this? I'm sorry, not why. Why asks for an opinion. For what reasons? ground that in why you do it.
It's not a trick question.
I think
not true.
there's two answers. I think there's two answers. One's historically, and so that was very economic development, whether it's community development, economic development, and bringing businesses into town.
Okay.
And then more so a shift, which I believe is a good one, with more aiming to achieve civic ends rather than purely economic ones. Not that the economic ones are also not civic, but focusing now on things like affordable housing development and helping that to happen. I think a lot of our abatements of late have been in that regard.
Okay.
He said what I was going to say.
That's the right answer if you're going second.
Yeah.
Not if I go first. I don't know if it's the right answer.
I think that's pretty much what the abatements have been for.
Okay.
A lot of bringing businesses here. And finally it's moving towards helping the citizens as well. So.
Okay. And when you say it's finally moving towards, you see that as a positive?
Absolutely.
Okay. Fiona, would you mind passing that to me?
Thank you.
You have any other?
Is this the round table? Oh, okay. I mean, I think that's part of the reason why the committee was formed, is how do we shift? And we're asking those questions because needs of the community are changing.
Okay. So if you go to the next page, from a theory of, or,
I want to hear.
you want to hear
Councilmember
Bert?
Allen.
I got
Yeah,
the
there's
Bert.
Yeah, y'all are covered. I mean, I think that's the whole thing, is just the movement we've made from economic development to other things that the market's not gonna develop, is not gonna deliver unless we provide an incentive that we know the city needs.
Yeah, you were right to step back. That's actually a more nuanced and deeper version of it. That's great. All right. So from a theory of governance, what are you trying to achieve? And for me, the GFOA best practice is quoted there in the first bullet point. It says, but for the TIF assistance, but for is a standard that you're going to hear over and over again. But for the TIF assistance, the development would not be possible. And anytime you're hearing TIF, you can just substitute that with abatement. You can substitute that with credit. You can so that the conversation, TIF is the most documented. So I use that, and the best practice we've done is around TIF. But I also bring in some of our economic development BPs as well. So what you're doing is you're covering the delta on a capital stack for projects that otherwise would not have been started or completed. Okay, and in the theory of governance, you're buying something. You're actually paying for something, and you're balancing the risk of paying for the displacement of that risk. And we'll talk about that more in a second. And you're also trying to achieve a social benefit. Developments are achieving a public policy goal. So Berkeley gets the gold star, but you all got in there, right? Like it's in and around exactly what you guys were saying. From a theory of governance, you also have to know, so if those are what you're setting out to do, did you do it? So you have to know if you're achieving the goals. What are the project performance matrices, and what are the internal processes for measuring those project performance matrices? So this is what we're trying to do. This is how we're measuring whether we achieved it, and this is how we know whether it happened. And when did you know that the projects, so whatever you've done from an individual project abatement, so we did this building on this block at this time, was that one successful, or the initiative as a whole? So whether that be a policy goal or a zone that you've set up to do economic development or both, when do you know that they're completed? And I say to you that the private sector is never going to raise their hand and say, we're not, you actually have paid us 2 years too long. We never needed this. They're going to redo their capital stack and take it into, the private sector is never going to give you that answer. You have to actually answer that for yourself. All right, now this is where, the next one, I get a little, this is a little professory, but I love this stuff, right? This is back into the 50s and 60s, the Musgraves, Peggy and Robert, give us the theory and practice in public finance. So this is one of the seminal documents in why we do public finance at all. And Peggy and Robert tell us in 1973 that making the fiscal systems work is, after all, a large part of making democracy function. And if you want a sentence for why I work at GFOA, that's it. I honestly believe that the work of public finance is the bedrock of democracy, that this working is what makes everything work. And then for all of you who got any sort of a liberal arts degree at all back in your sophomore year philosophy class, you probably read John Rawls or Part of Theory of Justice. And John Rawls is the thinker that talks about the veil of ignorance and designing systems that we can discuss whether or not it worked, but the meritocracy, that we should need to design systems that support every individual. And there are two other things that, from a theory of governance, I'd like you to think about that you're doing. One is you're actually making generational decisions, right? And I say this all the time in capital planning. When you're doing 30-year planning, you're building the city that your grandchildren will choose to live in or choose to leave, right? So when you are doing this work in terms of thinking about this increment work, you are doing what John Rawls is talking about here. And as he says, you're not simply handing more wealth to another generation. The saving is demanded as a condition of bringing about the full realization of just institutions and equal liberties. You are actually building a system that you're going to hand to them, not just dollars in a savings account. And then that fourth principle of exchange, this is where Rawls updates Musgrave's work, I think, well, and says that you are working on a principle of efficiency and institute. And in fact, you are creating a special trading body that arranges for public goods and services where the market mechanisms break down, right? So pure public goods are never going to be provided by the market, but there is a moment where these aren't two things that exist in isolation. They're nebulous and they touch each other. And so your work here is your incentive to bring the public sector, the private sector into the public sector and help to perform some public good, right? So as I go to the next one, my answer, so taking off my GFOA hat, Kyle's answer is to why a government should give an incentive or an abatement is that it's a governmental payment to achieve a public policy goal or goals through economic development, right? You are paying for this to incentivize the private sector to do some economic development, but it should be to some public policy end. Okay. And as Dr. Lukongo, my dissertation chair, would be disappointed if I gave a presentation without a chart. So there's a chart, right? But it is this idea that if you think about what you're trying to do in these incentives, there's a risk to the city, and the risk to the city is two-pronged. One is that a development never happens, so there's no tax income there, or that a public policy challenge is not solved. And so what you're paying the private sector to do is to shift those risks down. So you're paying for that risk shift to the private sector. In the next chart, what I'm showing is you as a governmental entity should be aiming for that sweet spot with the intersectionality. If you as a government don't figure out how to effectively monitor whether or not the incentives you gave were correct, and they're being implemented correct, and they're for the right time, and that the person that or the entities that you've given these incentives to are doing the right thing, then if they don't do what they said they were going to do, and they don't do it in the time they said they were going to do it, and you never check them on it, the risk is returning to the city and you're still paying for it. Mm-hmm. So a well-managed system of abatements and credits and increments, what you should be doing is measuring with them whether or not it's doing what they said, they're doing what they said they would do, and it's doing what you wanted it to do. And if you get wildly successful and the ecosystem that you're doing in this shifts and everyone is making the money as fast or faster than they thought they would, there should be a moment where you say, this is done and we've achieved what we're doing and we're going to stop. And that would be benefit back, dollars back to the government for effective management. Okay.
Can I ask one question?
Absolutely.
Here? So in a TIF scenario, that makes good sense to me. That's when you say this redevelopment district has blown up, it's great, we don't need to renew it or whatever. In a pilot scenario where we have given a tax break for someone to provide affordable housing, then if you know, it's year 8, and people have been living there for 8 years, paying prices that are only 30% of their income, we'd love for them to keep doing it forever, but our deal only goes to, I mean, evaluation-wise, is that just a black and white, are
So-
you doing it or not?
So here's what I would say is, the evaluation is, are they really
Are they really?
doing it at 30% AMI or 50% AMI or 60% AMI? If you're going in and they are able to pay more and they're charging more because their market rate, do you adjust the pilot there? When you get to the end of the pilot, are you going to renew that pilot? You should be evaluating all the way across. Yeah, they've been able to do 60% AMI, but they're at 70% occupancy. They can't keep it fully occupied, so do it. So I think think about it as calibration too, that you're going in and you're evaluating because you want to find that sweet spot. You want this to be working at the highest possible level of efficiency. And as you're doing whatever analysis you're doing, and you know, Bob and I were talking about this earlier, you're guessing. I mean, it can be a really good, and you can get outside entities that are experts to come in, but you're trying to find that sweet spot of that delta, and you may have missed it, up or down a little bit, and you may want to calibrate and adjust that, but you want to get as close as you can to just living inside of that delta.
Good answer. Thank you.
All right, management of process. So I say this, I mean, Josh can, well, you can vouch or not, I got a little laugh from this, but if you're a finance officer, oftentimes you get called into a problem. And by that I mean, someone calls you into their office and says, so we've committed ourselves to spending $2 million, I just need to know which fund it's gonna come out of, right? Finance gets called in at the very end of the process. And so when you call me in as the finance director at the end of the process, I would say to people all the time, you've taken away my windshield and my gears. I can't see anything, I don't know anything. And when you take away my windshield, my gears, I got one thing left, and that's the brake, and I'm gonna hit it every time. So I think a lot of the time with these incentives, you have a bunch of work that gets done, and then it gets dropped on you. And you say, project's ready to go, it's shovel ready, we're gonna walk on this, but we need the incentive, and we need it, we got 30 days. And there's no time to do the evaluation, and so you get into these projects before you start doing the evaluation. So from a management of process standpoint, it is important to have all of the entities that are going to be involved in this involved early on. You need to know who is in charge, who is the person driving these processes, who's making what decisions based on what criteria, who manages abatements across their life cycle. So it may be one entity that is making decisions on project appropriate and another doing that annual evaluation. How do you quiet some of the jurisdiction shopping? So because you're in an area that has been doing these incentives for quite a long time, or these abatements or these credits, what you don't want to do is get really good at stopping it in one corner of the metro government just to have them go to the stadium authority or the convention bureau or the industrial relations. You get what I'm saying? And then interrogation of the current process. So what should be the time frame? Is it annually, where whatever process you have in place is interrogated, that you go back and you review it, and who reviews that macro process, right? So are the zones right? Are the criteria for the projects that are eligible for abatement right? The language at inception. Who's writing the language at the front end of every abatement or at every increment district or at every credit?
All right, let's turn that into a real question instead of a
Okay.
rhetorical one. Josh, who's writing that language? I mean, do we have standardization between IDB, HEB, MDHA? Should we?
I mean, I think we should. The short answer is that we don't have standardization. I mean, a lot of the agreements do come through Metro Legal, but
After they're done.
after they're done, but.
And so if Josh had a handle on saying, this is our standard language, this needs to be in everything.
Yeah.
A year later, when someone goes to evaluate it, it doesn't matter who it came out of, they're evaluating the same language, and you're getting the same reports back.
Yeah.
So there's the same standards of what we're looking for, and the reports aren't performative, the reports are actually performing the functions that we want to see. We ask for the things we want to see, we get back what we've asked for, and we tell them if it's working.
Gotcha.
And then on the micro, thank you for that. And then on the micro agreements, the review of the deals to continue abatement eligibility, right? So you have that macro process, and then on the micro, you want to be looking at each of those annually, I would say, on some maturement date, to say, yeah, this is still doing what we set out to do and said what we were going to do. All right, so GFOA best practice. There's three parts to this: creation, implementation, and evaluation. We've touched on some of this, but I want to highlight it as the best practice. So creation, clear objectives and goals. And again, this is the best practice. I'm using the language of the best practice. The best practice about TIF, but it could be for any abatement. So clear objectives and goals for the abatement and the districts. So creating clear standards up front. Districts should look at revenue implications for all overlapping tax districts. So we were talking about this earlier. Schools are often, because they're property tax based, hammered into this. So if there are multiple taxing implications overlying districts, you need to look at it for each of the districts. And you need to think about veto provisions, and we'll talk about this a little more. But if a taxing district has a right to say, no, we don't want to be part of this for reasons. The review process for proposed projects, and really getting tight on that, but for the TIF assistance and the public policy goals. So both should be there. What is it that we're providing financially, and what are we looking to do from a public policy basement? And an establishment up front, this is, for projects, who's backing the debt, who maintains the asset, and what standard for you guys, the impact fees, who's responsible for the surrounding work, streets and improvements, project reporting and monitoring, what are we looking for, and when are we looking to get it back from you? And then I wanted to highlight this because it was broached in the draft report that I saw. Once a TIF is created, it can be very difficult to change the terms or cancel the agreement. Once that horse is out the barn, you can send the vet to check on it, but you ain't getting it back in the barn, right? It's gone. So the calendar is all that's going to solve some of these challenges that you have maybe out in the world. And that's just how that is. You should go back. You should still go back and monitor and hold them tight. But once it's created, your time to do your due diligence is before you say yes. And then implementation. I'm not going to read through all this, but if the TIF is warranted, the estimation of the increment is incredibly important. That shouldn't be guesswork. That should be tight. And if you need outside professionals to do that, that's worth the time, energy, effort, and resources to do that. We'll talk about this in a bit. In some other governments, that's binding, meaning we're agreeing to how much you're getting. So if the TIF overperforms, that money is going to come back to the government. That money just doesn't go into the capital stack and roll. And then the development plan and agreement are critical, and these are things that it should include. I highlighted one. Consider a board for multi-jurisdictional TIF abatement management. That you guys have different entities here that have the ability to give abatements and credits and increments. And so figuring out a way that you have some joint mutual benefit conversations so that everyone's using the same standards, everyone uses the brilliance of Josh's language, right? Like, so that everyone, I'm saying that jokingly, but I'm not. Like, if you're gonna align this thing, get this thing aligned and have everyone using off the same. And then evaluation. Once the increment or abatement is awarded, clear and centralized government monitoring. And the example that we've used a couple times today is grants management. You may let different departments write the grant application, but once the grant is done, you want someone monitoring that and making sure that we're following all the rules and not gonna have to pay it back, right? So there may be a different entity that is monitoring versus the letting of. Activation of best practices, I put into, and this was Talia's request, before you do any abatement. So this standard is, as you guys are thinking about this is living differently tomorrow than you lived yesterday. So there's the issue of the ones that are already out in the world, but before you do any abatement, clear objectives and goals, review of process both for policy and the but for, estimation of the increment, development of plan, establishing and monitoring. The second to last one is the only one that I deviates a little bit from the best practice, and that is ability to activate an articulated clawback provision, right? And so in our best practices for economic development on the next page, those performance standards, if places, developers, projects do not meet the performance standards, in many cases, there are clawback provisions to say, you didn't do what you said you were going to do. We're taking the resources back because we still need to fulfill this public policy goal. So that's done as a pretty common practice in economic development. You can write the policy. You have to have the mechanism and the will to exercise that. But if you're doing annual evaluations, that gets easier. And that comes from our best practice in economic development. And just so you know, I've shared this presentation electronically with Talia. I will share it electronically. Because Dr. Lukongo raised me right, there's a references page with links to everything that I used in here that y'all are welcome to have.
This might be a sidebar, but how often do you see those clawback provisions exercised?
Oh.
I mean, because that just seems like that's a sticky situation.
It
Just
is.
curious.
So you'll. It takes a lot of will to do that. So more often than not, what you see is a threat, and people start acting right, or an end to whatever it is. And it's easier if it was a pay-go versus a lump sum up front, because a lump sum up front, sometimes then you're in the courts. But what you'll see with Minnesota's provisions is they have sunsets at different durations, so they have different length of time that are the caps. And if you're not performing, I'll give you a year to perform, and if it's not performed, it's done, and we're going to start taking the increment
Just
back.
curious, okay.
Or we're gonna end your abatement, or the pilot is no longer. So clawback, stopping and
Just some
doing full
form,
freight charge
yeah.
going
Checks
forward,
and
that
balances, yeah.
happens more.
Yes.
And I will say Nashville, for our economic incentives, which we haven't done any in a while to speak of, there were sort of two parts to it. One was the TIF, and the other was kind of the jobs grant. And we learned the hard way the importance of saying, you know, we'll give you that money after we see those people
Yes,
arrive.
Yes.
So we've
yes.
done a better job of building that in
Yes.
back when we were doing economic incentives to bring jobs. But now our focus is more on creation of affordable housing. So again, can you help me think through what would a clawback look like for a college?
I mean, when you get into it, again, people said they were going to do certain things and they're not doing them.
Gotcha.
And so, you know, said I was going to do, no problem. People said they were gonna do, 70 units and they did 50. People said that they were gonna do 80% AMI and they're doing 100% AMI. Like, they're
Gotcha.
not doing what they said they were gonna do.
Gotcha.
Okay, long-term financial plan. So,
Do you mind if I ask something?
Certainly, Mr. Mendez, you're recognized.
I don't think I'm on camera, so Bob Mendez from the mayor's office. With the clawback with TIF, would that typically be subordinate to the primary lender's rights? It would have to be, right?
yeah, so it gets really tricky if it's a pay-go situation and you've got multiple years on. In some cases, it would be potentially changing the development agreement to bring in additional or different partners. It gets really complicated. But you're right. In the capital stack, it gets really hard to say I'm taking this ball and going home. It's called a clawback provision, but a lot of times it is just a different plan provision more than anything else.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Long-term financial planning. So this is not exactly on point as it relates to the incentives, but it is on point as it relates to your desire to talk about CAP, and it is this. For communities and governments, at GFOA, we recommend that you be looking 10 to 20 years down the road in your financial plan, looking at all the economic conditions and thinking about what this looks like. And inside of that long-term financial plan, What I'm saying is there should be a yield analysis on abatements through maturity for each taxing district. And so, you know, for the city, you should be looking at when these maturity cycles are gonna hit, what the full abatement you have floating out there is, because it may be that you have a desire to do X number of dollars in abatements or pilots or TIFs for 25, 26, 27, 28, and that's great. But if you don't know what is already out there in the world, what are you stacking that on top of? So thinking about what's already out in the world and then doing yield curves that, even though you're doing maybe great public policy work, you need to know the total impact. And again, going back and being really good stewards of those projects that are already out there and maybe getting some of those closed out. If you're looking at because you're buying things, this is money that you are spending, whether or not it feels like that. So looking at what you're buying and looking at what you're spending from a long-term financial plan should be treated as other revenues. That would be my opinion to you. All right, and then I put my curve back in because again, with all of this I've described, that benefit for effective management comes back as more resources for you to do work directly from metro government as a revenue, or more work with different abatements for different projects in different parts of the city. Okay, other jurisdictions. So the state standards are really good because it levels the playing field in a regional standard. You don't get that squeezing of the balloon where behaviors change based on where you're living. You know, so if here you are, sir.
Thank you.
So if you are the only jurisdiction that's really being disciplined, then people are just going to step across the county line and do it somewhere else, right? So a level playing field stops some of that regional shopping. The challenge is, and I've heard over the course of today, that there is a challenged relationship with the state in terms of coming to places where you see eye to eye on issues like this. And the one-size-fits-all may not work for some of the exoburbs, the suburbs, or the rural parts of Tennessee in the same way that you need it to work in Nashville. Other jurisdictions also have inconsistency on so special boards, things like the convention center or the stadium authority or Metropolitan Housing or the industrial board, whether their debt counts towards the total cap for the city. So as you're managing what the debt thresholds are, it's inconsistent across other jurisdictions. So there's a lack of transferability to abatement caps. There's not a lot of abatement caps, and it's unclear how the special districts would count into an abatement cap. Authorities relative to special districts. So again, in a lot of cases, you don't have total authority over these special districts. Rather, you got a couple of seats on their board, right? So how do you really have these conversations of control? Ability of tax entities to opt out of abatements. We'll talk a little about this. And again, school districts are the most impacted, where we're giving away for an economic incentive deal money that another entity, another taxing district actually really needs, and there's a reason. My example that I've been using all day is COVID. If there was a tax district that was tourism-based that saw an immediate drop-off and you tried to put an abatement on top of them, they would say, you're killing me, I can't do that, I can't afford what I got right now, I need to be out of this abatement because I need that tax cash flow.
And, you know, as we talked about, except for the tax, I think our special districts tax-wise tend to be sales tax related as opposed
Yep.
to property
Property
tax.
tax.
And that's one of the questions that Mr. Mendez had raised that we really haven't talked about a lot is how do we look at the sales tax redirect, which mostly happen at the state level for the most part.
And I think
But do they go into our chart of long-term impacts of?
it's revenue
tax
you're not
abatements?
getting, so I would not be against looking at it. I also
Okay.
think there are some arguments that need to be made. Two examples I gave earlier, the Amazon deal in Alexandria, Virginia. Their agreement on their TIF district was that there would be a mutual benefit component for a district that was outside of the buildings that were being TIF'd because they were doing a multi-site, multi-building campus. And so what Alexandria agreed to do was to use the TIF, but to use it inside of a wider jurisdiction than just those buildings. So they did improvements to the metro stop. They're doing some connectivity to Reagan National Airport, because that's all beneficial to the people that are coming in, to and from and using the Amazon campus on a daily basis. They did some parks, some greening, some infrastructure improvements, some green infrastructure. That's one. The second is in Minnesota, when you set up multiple TIFs, they allow you to draw a zone around those multiple TIFs. And inside of that, you can do some pooling. So if there was some need, let's say it's a lot of housing concentration, and you needed to do a new bus stop or some enhanced linear infrastructure, pipes, the lighting, those kinds of things, you could do some pooled from the TIF, and people that have to agree to it, but you can do some infrastructure investments inside of those pooled. Standards for appropriate use of abatements. The but-for standard is one. Tightening up what you're trying to achieve is really important, because it used to be that they said these TIFs or these abatements were to be used to cure or solve blight. Right? Define blight for me. Like that is actually an opinion. There is no standard of blight. And so a lot of jurisdictions said farms were blight. Right? Jurisdictions that were looking to develop out into exurbs or suburbs said that farm is blight. There ain't no farm that's blight. It's a lower tax base than the mall you're trying to put there. So getting tight on what you're trying to achieve, and then oversight and monitoring. Some states do oversight and monitoring, and some don't. All right, so let's talk about, I've been saying Minnesota and over. So I'm going to give you a mix of examples. I'm going to give you some strong examples, and then I'm going to give you some less strong examples. And because we're in this together, I'm going to use my home state as one of the less strong examples. So, all right, Minnesota. The but-for test is there. Finding the requirements, but they got pretty good. They've gone back and revisited this a number of times over the years. So they have specifics about what is even allowed in the state of Minnesota as an appropriate use. So you see the standards there, and different durations attached to them. So for some, you get more time that the district could be a max, and for some, you get shorter.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
What was their process for deciding each of these? Was each of them done by the entity that does it?
And have been changed across time. So I
Right.
think they've gone back and seen how they performed. I think there's some means testing inside of all of this. They also articulate an increment in the initial agreement, and all parties sign off on that increment, meaning this is the maximum that this project is going to get. So in a year that the increment outperforms, because the work you all have done in Nashville, and should have started, like, there are great things happening in this community, extraordinary things. Anyone that can have world-class Bluegrass, Yo-Yo Ma, and John Batiste performing within 3 miles of each other over 48 hours is doing something okay, right? And this is from New Orleans saying it, like, I'm impressed. So I think there are phenomenal things happening here. You have changed some of the economic ecosystems by the projects you've done. So if that's the case and the project overperforms, you're partially responsible for that. By you, I mean the citizens of and the city of Nashville and Metro government. You should enjoy the benefits of that overperformance, and that's what happens in Minnesota. There's an annual calculation, and if there is an excess increment, they do one of two things. They agree to prepay the outstanding bonds so that the abatement or the pilot or the TIF ends earlier, or they do a proportional distribution to city, county, and school district, meaning whatever you were going to get before you get now. Okay, so that's Minnesota. Texas, I'm not here to stand up for this because I've had a lot of conversations with my friends there, and the TERS, as they call them, the reinvestment zones, work but don't work. Again, you've got a but-for test. The two things I want to call out on this is this one does have a cap. On page 2, it describes, it's a geographic cap, so you can't have more than 30% of the property in a zone eligible for increments or abatements. So it does have a cap, though my friends in Texas will say that it's not something that they believe the government would ever enforce, meaning no one's ever been called for being at 32%, right? So, you know, you can have all the rules you want on the books. If you have an enforcement issue, you don't have rules. So that's one. But two, they do, and it's pretty complicated, but they do let tax entities choice out. If you are showing that you actually can't be part of this abatement because of current struggles in terms of your revenues based on taxes, property taxes, you're allowed to not participate. So the increment shrinks based on that. So you have an opt-out provision and you have a geographic cap, which are the two highlights for Texas. Massachusetts is probably the tightest in terms of governing. Any city or town that wants to have a district has to apply to the state. They have to articulate a plan, they have to articulate the zone in which that plan will be implemented, and then every individual agreement comes back to the state. So that is, from a TIF perspective, that's the tightest, and it's a 20-year max. So the state reviews the plans, the zones, every individual projects, and gives you the max. So that's as tight as it gets. And then we get to my people in Louisiana. So
It seems a lot more complicated already.
well, so this is there's a couple of things here I want to point out. One, this was not actually a law, right? This is an administrative standard. So this could be given or taken away by the stroke of a pen, and that's what happened this month. So it is an abatement for 80% of your tax responsibility for up to 10 years for any manufacturing investment. So any capitalized investment in manufacturing, you get an 80% abatement. You're new to the state, you return to the state, this is equipment you were gonna replace anyway, this is a brand new, any of it, 80% abatement. Last governor said, we shouldn't just be giving this away, so I'm asking for two things back. One, there has to be some component of job creation. And two, school districts can opt out. If the school district doesn't want us, because the state was handing away the taxes of localities, because the district, the ITEP district, is coterminous with the borders of the state of Louisiana. So the last governor said, has to be job creation, has to be an ability for opt-out provisions from the school districts. As I was getting ready to present to the fine people of Nashville, our new governor came in last week and eliminated the job creation provision and the opt-out provision because it was administrative. So now this is just an 80% tax abatement for anyone who asks for it again. I see none of you will be joining me on the plane tomorrow. All right, California. So California is also a story of a cautionary tale. They were one of the earliest states to really get into the TIF business. And this is one where, and I think for you guys, this is a really informative, you guys, for you as a group that is thinking about the long-term viability of this for this community. It's really important to consider this one because this is one where politics keep getting involved. So, you know, the Detroit didn't fail, Detroit didn't plan. Detroit never saw themselves shrinking. They kept planning for the city that was going to be versus the city they were and the city they became. So California keeps giving these increments as if the world is never going to change. And then in 1978, a property tax cap came in, which I know is something that's being discussed in Tennessee. And so localities had a real problem generating revenue off of their property taxes. So because of that, they put in a voter proposition and they said, we can't afford to do schools anymore. State of California, you're going to do schools. And when the state had to take on the schools, they said, well, fine. We're going to come back and raid the TIF districts, and we're going to take money out. So anyone who has excess in any of their special districts, we're taking that money out. And then there was another voter proposition that said, well, you can't come into our special districts. And so in 2012, Governor Brown goes, you know what, we're broke and we're done. We're out of the TIF business. So all of these plans get caught in the politics, and when that is solved, or when that is settled in 2012, there's still $5 billion a year out there sitting in these different TIF projects that are just going to have to retire across time. And communities are having to figure out other ways to solve for policy issues, because as we've discussed, there is some real benefit to doing these projects and doing them well with purpose and with meaning. So the baby and the bathwater both went at the same time in California. And then the silent partner, I'm gonna speak to school districts, and Berkeley's schooled me on, it's a little bit different here, but I was the deputy CFO of a school district that was in the throes of a long-term abatement project. So for almost 30 years, so when Ed Rendell becomes mayor of Philadelphia, the city is bleeding, the city is losing population, the city is struggling. So he said, I will give a 10-year abatement to anyone who builds a business or a home in this city to recruit people back. So a 10-year abatement on all the improvements you do to your home or your business, which was argued to me that was necessary at the time. I was in finances there in the early 2000s, and I don't have to explain this to you, but what happens if you give away 10 years worth of abatements and a bunch of people move back and they want to send their kids to public schools, is I need the money to, public schools are basically like Social Security. I get money for the one who's in the seat today, and I need to provide education for them today. They have continued to do this abatement for almost 30 years. And so as of 2024, there's about $2.8 billion in needed capital improvements because there's been a lack of, I would argue, as the former finance, there's been a lack of resources flowing back in because of this abatement that over penalizes the school district because it goes straight to property tax. So these are the kinds of things that I think you're in such a fantastic position because none of this has happened to you yet. So I hand you the cautionary tales to say, if you don't live differently tomorrow, this is what it could look like. So challenges, talked about the local cap without a state cap. The local cap, a full or a partial lid, I want you to think about whether or not you can actually get your hands all the way around all of these different entities, how you need to have some mutual benefit conversations with anyone who can give these incentives, abatements, credits. The third bullet point on here, and this is challenging for many jurisdictions, not just Nashville, all of these pilot abatement conversations are binary. So they act as if, and I apologize to all of our developer friends in the room, but they act as if the world has two realities. Nothing is ever going to happen here, or we do my project. And these are the world's only two realities, when in all actuality, 5 years down the road, we may do a lesser project. And so from a public finance standpoint, my argument with these projects has always been, it's actually not this is an incentive, it's more like this is an incentive, meaning there's a reality in front of us that none of us can see out in the everything always all at once, right? Where there's a different reality that we could all be living, and it would have us getting some money for this. We might get the Courtyard by Marriott instead of the infinity pool at the W, but it would be a reality for all of us, right? And so the path not taken is never figured into this. And so I say that to say, doing some shorter time frames, doing some things where you can come back and revisit this, being really tight on coming back and looking at that on the annual basis is really, I think is really important. And then finally, you asked me to do something, and I'm a good student, so I do it. Good Jobs First, which you can tell by the name, might have a slight political angle, was one of the only places that recommends an equalized value-based cap. But no state has that in place, and it's unclear what their rationale is for that 2%. So it's not something I can stand by. It's something that is out there in the universe, but it's not anything that anyone has implemented.
That's basically 2% of the general fund. Is that
equalized valuation cap? So the same way you're thinking about what your debt cap is, what you should be doing, like your total property equalized valuation base. And I think it's a number plucked out of a visceral computer somewhere. Okay.
I bet Eugene knows it.
All right, so positives on your draft reports. I like the idea of the transparency database. My additional policy consideration would be the shared mutual benefits board, making sure that everyone is giving really good information and tying into that so that everything can be known.
And that, just a quick question, since we're wanting to bring it down. So that sounds like a great idea. How would we go about that? I mean, creation of a board and then that means IDB, representative, all of the MDHA would sit on this board. Who would appoint that, create that? I'm just,
If you guys are in power, I would say
are we
you
in
make,
power? Like, I don't think we're in power.
you make the power
That's why
live-
I'm asking.
You make the power live where I think it makes most sense, which, you know, in any city, if so now I'm taking off my GFOA hat and I'm putting on my having used to do this hat. I mean, mayor's office, I mean, you pick the place where it can actually have some teeth and some ability to pull things in, so I don't actually have an opinion on this.
Who has done this successfully? I'm just curious, communities.
I don't see anyone out there, as I'm looking at it, who has a really good handle on all of these special districts. And I think you guys are actually in a position pretty unique. Austin, maybe, I mean, because in a lot of cases, you're now fighting the exact reason that these things were developed. These things were developed because the development community thought that it was inefficient to do all this through City Hall or through a council's office. And so they developed these standalone boards and these standalone districts to be more efficient and more dynamic. And now they've done what they said. If your perception is they've done what they set out to do, and I heard that at the beginning as you guys were talking, they used to be for economic development, but we've done all we need to do in that. It used to be for job creation, we've done all that. So now it's time to rein some of that in. So I don't know that there's a lot of economies that are as mature as yours that have done that really good work and are trying to now come back and rein that in.
In a sense, our city council working effectively as a shared mutual benefit board? MDHA pilots come through council.
We approve everything.
Yeah, so basically there is a lot, like there is I think my understanding is we do actually have a governing body and it's
I think
40.
this was more around the micro and macro, or looking back not on a project by project basis, but setting up a
Both
sharing.
need to happen.
Both need to happen.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know if council has that capacity to be setting up the legal.
Well, and the person who
sharing
has the
practice.
stick is probably the best person to figure out a carrot strategy as well.
I mean, we've talked about the website living under the trustees' domain, and that seems to make sense, because that's a logical place for everybody to come to for information, but that's very different from who's gonna sit down once a year or once every 5 years and go,
Or even more, right, to say we're gonna do standardized language, you know, for the but-for provision and or, but just getting people to meet is a great idea, like to talk, because it is so different in every department. I mean, we've had a hard time following it, candidly.
And I think getting really tight on what you're looking for that database to do, I think it's positive, but I think it also needs to have the data that you would want to be using to do that annual evaluation process. I mean, if you're gonna have something that's gonna take the work like this, that's gonna take to create it, have multiple goals passing through it. So using that to be the place where you're collecting the data that you're gonna go to do the evaluation makes a lot of sense to me.
so right now, we have sort of partial models for this. MDHA is required to do an annual report on their low-income housing tax credit pilots. And that report shows up, and there's a place where we can go and find it now. And I presume Industrial Development Board similarly has, not yet, but
They need one.
they're working on policies and procedures. So that, we need to connect with that board, because they're in the process of doing that stuff.
And I don't know what that report has in it, but certainly you would want some drill down provisions to be able to find the data that you're looking for to do the annual evaluations.
Right. I mean, I think this group has the authority to make the recommendations for all these things. And I think part of what we want to be very thoughtful about is not just saying they need to do this. We got to figure out who they is as well.
Yeah.
I think in the second point, the reauthorization with MDHA, the additional policy considerations are, if you're gonna do another letter of, or memorandum or cooperative endeavor, whatever it is, reviewing the current timeframes, the agreement standards, the zones, the ongoing Dale review, like all of this stuff, should be part of that letter, and that would then be a model of what you're doing with, you know, the Industrial Review Board or whoever else you're doing this with. This, we're all gonna be in agreement, we're all gonna be on the same page.
So there needs to be a joint meeting, I think.
Pastor needs to bring the choir together, so everyone's singing the same tune.
I mean, would it, not to simplify, but like, would it be that IDB, they're doing the micro reviews, right? But you're saying this board is looking at a macro, because there's no one really looking at a macro view.
I think
And so
you
this
guys,
board, as combinations of those, would
and then
be,
you guys are
that
the
would be
Nashville
the charge.
experts, so as you're talking about who does what in terms of yours, like, you're the experts on that, I don't.
We are feeling our way forward. And we brought you in hoping you could point to some other city or cities that have done it at this level.
I would say it's the reverse. I would say if you guys get this right, you're who we're gonna come back
All
and
right.
win.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Refine and implement more focused abatement eligibility criteria. You guys are already on that, like getting really narrow. This is what we were trying to achieve. This is the box. Fit in that box where you don't get an abatement, don't get a pilot, don't get it. And then the transit orient develop utilization. I thought this was interesting. It was a place that you said, we'd actually like to add this too, like yes and. And so I think if you go to a place where we've been talking about, and I think this is where you're headed, we've got a lot already out there, so it's gonna limit the amount that we maybe could do. So we're down to 50 million or 40 million or 30 million or whatever that million number is. Then you also want to think about, because you would do this in economic development, an intersectionality bonus, meaning if you're doing transit and housing, you're number one. If you're just doing one of these things, then you're 2 or 3. Right, so as you're doing scoring ranks and matrices, people that are achieving multiple public policy goals get bumped to the top.
But often they're not competing against each other. I mean, if I'm going to the IDB looking for money and I'm going to HEFB looking for money, those don't get ranked against each other.
Well, but at the end of the day, if you are operating from a place where you're being told we got this much, again, this is where the tight, where I want your tight cap to start to fit. To say, yes, so I'll give an example. So on that, it's not abatements, but the way that a lot of these special districts have been set up over the years, I've had municipalities come back and say, yeah, but that doesn't count against our debt cap. Okay, but you still got to pay all of it. And if you are the city is the ultimate responsibility for the full faith and credit, and you're going to the voters and you're asking for more money, then these local villages are gonna compete. I don't care what the law says and I don't care what the policy says, someone's gonna tell you, no. Because you're asking me for money again and I don't understand what I'm already paying for, right? So this is one of those logic moments where, yes, you are the expert on Nashville, and I believe that you could go to both of those boards and ask for different things and get abatements. But there is a moment inside of this where you have to say, and all of the abatements are coming out of the pot that is Metro Nashville, so we're gonna pay attention to all of them in the same way.
Gotcha.
Okay. The report observations, local cap without state cap invites jurisdiction shopping and competition, and that's tough. Local cap, if you went with a hard cap, it may cause needed projects, it may pause needed projects, right? So my caution to you of saying, we're gonna stop everything, which, you know, again, if you take away my windshield and my gauges, I'll hit the brake, and I understand why there's an appetite to hit the brakes. But if you do that for a long time, you may pause needed project and benefit non-performing projects. So I think this one's a yes and, that you have to go back and really do some interrogation of the existing projects, and with a very focused process, say yes to needed projects, but exercising a very narrow focus and a better understanding about what you already have out in the world and what you can afford. Special districts roles in abatement award and review process, and your example of sales tax is great on this. These special districts are pockets of authority and pockets of resources. And when those So now this is systems thinking, but when those get mature, they will fight to continue to exist. So you give someone a lot of money and a lot of power, they don't want to give either of those up. So I think having an understanding about some of these special districts and their role and getting tight on what that should be, so that they are always in service of the greater good, is important. And I know you have some challenges on that front. And then opportunity for tax entities to opt out of inclusion and abatement has precedence. So I think, and Berkeley, you talked about this, where you say you can't do 100% of the pilot, you can only do 75 because we want some money rolling back for the schools. That's totally appropriate, and you need to continue to calibrate that. You need the money to do the work of this city, so there is no absolute where abatements, credits, or TIF districts work in this way. It works for you or it doesn't work. Okay. So my final policy recommendations: management of the current universe. You need a clear and centralized government monitoring, a single point. You should immediately revisit conformity of all existing abatements to the agreements that they signed. Your award standards, both the public policy objectives and the build for standards, that's on a go-forward basis. Abatement agreement language, some ability to, when I say clawback, stop and move in a different direction on a go-forward basis. Goals, process, and responsibility, entity for evaluation, move to a single point of who's establishing those and who's doing those. So if that's poor Josh, I hope you have an army. But seriously, getting tight on language will help the second part of that on the monitoring. And then the districts and geographic areas for abatement. I think some of the ones that I talked to you, one of the worst ones, there's no means testings in them, right? When you draw something that is the entire city of Philadelphia, or the entire state of Louisiana, there's no means testing for this part needs it, this part don't. So, as you're looking at your districts, I was in the Gulch last night. They're doing fine, right? They have shifted wildly from the days I was walking across the dirt parking lot to go to the station and to what I experienced last night. So being willing to move some of those districts to say this part of Nashville actually does need some, and thinking about, and I say this, so again, in my previous lives, I was on the City Planning Commission in New Orleans for 10 years and was chair for a number of years. There are things that happened when the Gulch got developed in terms of displacement of communities, and thinking about doing the work that you need to help support the people that are no longer in the Gulch that are somewhere else in Nashville is really quite important. So thinking about how you do these incentives to support what is somewhere else. Doing the long-term financial planning, and then I understand, this statement gets funnier the more conversations I've had today, that Metro is not in control of state standards. In fact, you may want to say the exact opposite of what you want from the state to get back from them. I'm joking, but not really. So the state standards are positive for uniformity of jurisdictions and the development community. So if you could get on the same page, and the state would say, these are the things we can give incentives for, these are the durations, not unlike Minnesota, and that you knew that you were operating under the same standards as every other county and every other jurisdiction, that's hopeful, because then people can't jurisdiction shop, we're all in the same place, we're working, so.
I would ask, currently, 10 years ago, that was a problem. I remember one time we gave an incentive for something to move a mile across a county line. I still regret that vote. But that kind of stuff is not happening now. So I guess, just in terms of wrapping our arms around what we have to do, is there a problem with setting that one on the back burner and maybe some relationships will
There's not a problem with setting one on the back burner, and in fact, one of the things I would encourage is, as you're thinking about doing this, if you think about doing that board, if you think about doing that mutual benefit board, it wouldn't be insane if there is someone doing incentives and abatements for surrounding counties to invite them to sit at the table and have an understanding about what they're doing, so that there is some uniformity. And if you're going to have some shared practices, it doesn't hurt for them to have an understanding, especially if what you were describing is true, which is if there is some displacement of working middle class, working poor, displacement to other counties, they may be happy to hear and have some of these
Right.
conversations.
Right, that's a good point.
All right, and then you get my reference pages. There's a bibliography in here with all the stuff that's here, and I'm happy to send this electronically so the links actually work. 'Cause that in the analog format, they're a little less successful.
So you send it to me, I'll send it to Margaret, who will send it to the rest of the.
Great.
I don't know, maybe I need to think about this more in here before it comes out here, but, so if you're looking at, so some of these are going to a civic need, like affordable housing. You know, part of the issue is maybe the Gulch doesn't look like it needs it, but that's you know, you want them. You know what I mean? You don't wanna put them in areas that maybe have historically you've considered needs something, right? Cause you want a mix of income. So have you seen those districts be larger, and how do you control it? How do you put parameters
So-
on it? Because you want mixed income, right? You want everyone to be able to live in the happening place, and there needs to be a mix in community, in the utopia world, right?
I mean, that sounds wonderful.
It sounds wonderful, but sometimes, you know, when you're looking at, to offset and making it like a reality, when you can get market,
So I'm gonna
you
say this
need
back to you metaphorically. The best day to plant the tree is 20 years ago. Second best day to plant the tree is today. I think with the Gulch, if you didn't plant the tree 20 years ago, there's probably not many places to plant that tree today. to get the-
Ironically,
But there's
we did, but they were five-year, you know, incentives, and they burned off, and so they're,
They're annuals, not perennials.
yeah,
Yeah,
they're
they're
annuals,
annuals,
that's
not
exactly
perennials.
right, that's exactly.
Gotcha.
And I will say, and this is what I'm still trying to wrap my arms around, is TIF is based on a redevelopment district specifically, but we've got other incentives, like the mixed income pilot, which has a cap, that's anywhere. And some of those are being used downtown, and I just went to see one that's being used on Dickerson Road, and those ironically are being used in drastically geographically different areas, unfettered by, you know, where the tax redevelopment districts are, so, and
But the IDB can do it to anywhere.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
it's
geographically, it's
HHS,
different
development
between,
districts,
yeah, all the administrative bodies.
And so I think that's some of the stuff that needs to come
It's
into
very
alignment.
confusing.
And I think when you bring it into alignment, you raise a fantastic point in the idea that you want these things and these things meaning, if you're aiming at a public policy goal, but also remember that you're doing this through economic development, so the economic development piece is an important part of the partnership. And so if you're doing the market solution on that delta on the capital stack that Berkeley's describing, that's working for developing some housing around the city, hey, that's great. But if you want to do something that has transit oriented with the grocery store, with the hub that We Go is also thinking about, like if you want to do multiple and you want to do a couple of heavy hit and big, like that may be things that you need to do a little more than the developer fiat version of that, or the industrial board coming in to be a partner on, or going back to the housing and moving the zones where the zones are. So I mean, that more seismic version of it may require some alignment.
So, but, and you're saying the simple process and policy, the better. So if they were all geographically aligned, that would be the most simple. But the likelihood of that is probably not high.
You guys are moving a lot of pieces into alignment, so I wish I could hand you more technical fixes, but there's not, if you don't change the underlying, like you're gonna have the same problems over and over again. So a lot of these are adaptive changes. You need to change the systems to make the outcomes shift. So, you know, I think from a technical standpoint, you guys have done some good things in terms of stopping doing this and doing something different. But if what I'm hearing and what I've read is in a couple of cases with the industrial relations board, like there's a balloon that's getting squeezed, it's just happening somewhere else. And so I think that's the part from the adaptive change that you need to bring these systems into alignment.
Okay.
Gotcha.
so that it's a real cap, and then you have real change, and then the agreements are better and the monitoring.
And it will refine over time as they start to
Real
work
goals
together.
and real
Yeah.
priorities, and not just giving birth to an adult and we thinking, looks so great and shiny and wonderful as an adult. Then you're like, wait a minute, it ain't mature in that area. So, sometimes describes Nashville.
What's the old rich kid metaphor? Being born on third base and pretending you hit the triple?
Hey,
Right,
there you go. Yeah.
that's exactly
Yeah.
right. Well, this is the chart that then Councilmember Mendez created, and I have picked up and have as an appendix in the report, that looks at, you talked about, this is in the many drafts of the report they have on their website. But just looking at all the MDHA TIFs we've got out there and all the IDB pilots and all the whatever, and sort of looking at what those add up to together, and what sort of our future things that we're talking about doing, like transit-oriented development. The East Bank, we're starting to get a feel for what that number might be. So when you talk about incorporating this into our long-term economic strategy,
The long-term financial plan, yep.
the
yep,
long-term
yep.
financial plan, this is what was the language?
That's the building blocks of what that would look like.
Gotcha. And
And
then,
this is represented, it looks like, as a percentage of operating budget. You could do it as, I think, one of the places that looked at it as a percentage of
your total
the
evaluation.
equalized, your total valuation. I mean, there's different ways you could do that.
Gotcha.
You could do it as a percentage of revenues, which is a lot of times on the equalized value base, and on the reserve side, you can either look at budget or revenue. So I think there's different ways you could cut this. But at the end of the day, sitting with budget and saying, what is also our projected costs about what it's gonna, the expenditure and the revenue side. What is it actually gonna cost to do the work of the city over the next 10 years? And how does this impact the revenues we have, and not spending everything before we get there?
Right,
Which
which is the question
I
that,
compliment, I applaud the fact that you guys did the reserves. I think that's brilliant, by the way.
yes, good for the council and Kelly Flannery. I think that's true. More questions, thoughts, comments?
It's great.
Just thank you so much. I mean, this has brought so much clarity. All the stuff been rumbling in my head for the last couple of years. This is really good.
So my question is, our goal has always been to learn a whole lot and then ultimately come up with a report / recommendation to give to the Metro Council. And then hopefully there'll be enough guidelines there to implement what we finally figure out that needs to be. So, I think to recap, and Josh does everything anyway, so.
I'm sorry, we don't allow the public to speak. You missed the public comment period.
Yeah, I forgot to do it, so we'll open up for public comment now. You have 2 minutes.
Which role are you here? Mayor's of County?
So I'm trying to think about what will be most helpful for the mayor's office in the coming years. And for context, I got approached, say, in my role as a chief development officer about, I don't want to say the exact amount, but somebody asking for some tax increment financing that would be the second biggest one that the city's ever given. And just given where we're at, there's going to be a lot of that. And the thing that would be most helpful is it's interesting to hear that no other city has really cracked this nut about thinking about it holistically, and that maybe we're so maybe the effort to try to find the magic bullet is elusive, and we just need to figure out what's best for us. And I think for the job that I've got in the mayor's office and trying to advise the mayor about how to think about this, like a building block basic would be to push back as many years as we can to figure out, to collect the data about what is the total amount of abatements of every species,
That live out there in the world.
right? And collection and redirection, like TIF, and to try to do that chart that you just referred to instead of me, one council member sitting around off the top of my head trying to eyeball what it is to like get the total abatement / collection redirection number for as many, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, whatever we can pull together, and compare it to different metrics, whether it's operating budget, assessed value, expenses minus debt service. Like we can come up with 5 or 6 metrics, and at least know over the recent past whether the metrics are trending in a going up way or in a going down way or about stable, because I think we could, in the absence of a magic bullet solution that we can adopt from some other city, we could collectively have a feeling of, we haven't loved the transparency, but we're still in business, so it hasn't been too bad. Over the last 10 years, I think we could generally agree that the amount we spent hasn't put us out of business. And if it's flat or going down on the metrics, then that would tell us we're in good shape for us. Whereas if the metrics are going, up 15% every year, then maybe we should think about whether we want to keep doing a lot more. To me, that would be a helpful starting point, just to get the data.
Right.
I have a question. Yes, but in absence of holistic public policy or where we're going in the next 10 to 15 years, what metrics are we going to use? Because each deal had its own.
Yeah, and that's been my concern, as Councilmember Allen knows, is that I abhor the idea of the but-for analysis on a case-by-case basis, because every deal looks like we make nothing now, we'll make more than nothing. Obviously, that's a good deal. Let's do it.
But one thing we haven't had that we've already put in there, and turns out we were right to recommend it, is to go back and look at some of the past ones and say, how have those but-fors of the past?
Well, but that data is utterly flawed, and because all of them had no revenue and now they have some revenue. I think if I was gonna say another thing that would be helpful, and some of you heard me say this before, and I was interested to see it was one of the recommendations, is when developers go to bankers got a whole team full of people who are deciding whether they really need the loan and they can really support it. And Metro, going back to the 2019 Tax Increment Financing Committee we had, Metro recognized that we have utterly no ability to intelligently figure out whether the developer needs the money or not. So we don't really have a mechanism to answer the but-for question. And there are professionals out in the world that would cost money, but we could hire professionals that would be sharp-penciled people to answer the but-for question more seriously for us.
Or do what I remember when the deal came through, what Kelly Flannery, the prior director, says, make the developer pay for it with an independent body to do it, as opposed to bringing their own assessment that they've already paid somebody to do, which of course is gonna say their project is great.
Developers are already paying for MDHA's legal fees, right, or the IDB's legal fees.
And if Metro had, a panel of 2 or 3 or 4 people that we trusted, that the developer had to pay that fee to have us get the information.
And that the developer trusted too, right? I mean, a panel of 2, 3, or 4 folks who really understand this world inside and out.
Yeah, I've told the story to some of you before, like back before I was ever in office, I was representing in my law practice a party that was seeking a TIF, and administrations changed, and the TIF went from a higher number to a lower number, and the only difference in the construction was the top floor of a hotel went from being a ballroom to being hotel rooms. And so the extra amount of TIF, the but-for was whether we needed another ballroom. And I'm not clear that the money that they did get, whether it was any more of a careful analysis.
Well, I do have two thoughts as we sit here. One is what you mentioned about getting approached today. If you put Oracle aside, you know, for the last 5, 6, 8 years, we've lived in a pretty quiet TIF period, right? Because the city was doing this, developers really didn't need it. A lot of our priorities had been checked. People weren't coming. They knew downtown, the Gulch. I mean, the city, MDHA, Eddie wasn't interested in doing that. And then now we've hit this period, right, where so many deals are not penciling, right, because of interest rates, inflation, et cetera. And now it feels like, and just you begin to see just the last couple of days, new images being released on projects that it feels like those developers now begin to see out 12 months, 18 months of, hey, rates are going to come back down, prices have stabilized, we are going to come closer to penciling in a project, but boy, I just think we're now getting ready to go into a period where people are going to start asking again. And that also ties, I think, to the but-for test, to the extent that we trust both the Metro Council and the Mayor's office to be genuine reflections of our priorities at any point in time. It would be almost impossible, certainly politically and probably legally, to get a TIF approved by the IDB, by MDHA, the council, or somewhere in between, that a mayor and council didn't have a heavy hand in terms of making sure that this was an accurate reflection of our priorities today, right? Whether that's transit and housing together, whether that's transit, whether that's housing, et cetera, that it's hard to go slip one of these by when there is strong objections within the mayor's office and within the council.
And part of the 2019 TIF reform made it so the 30-year districts couldn't go more than 10 years without reaffirming consensus between MDHA and the council.
Because we have seen, like, I mean, our priorities have changed over time, right? It was residential, then it was hotel. I mean, now it feels like some housing component, and they're gonna, in 10 years from now, it's gonna be something different.
It's just more of a bolt-on. I think, you know, it's not just, you know, interest rates, construction costs, but in Nashville specifically, we have infrastructure issues that are, each development is being saddled with more and more of these capital improvements because we don't have the money as a city to holistically tackle them. So there is a convergence of piecemealing some capital projects together that would align with TIF too. But those are, it's just more of a bolt-on that you're seeing happening. And that can be easily assessed.
I think the combination of the but-for really being tied in, I think from a theory of governance, I really want to enforce to this group, you're paying for a public policy when you do one of these abatements. Like, you're paying, this is in lieu of you taking revenues in and then providing the service as the city. It's a partnership with developers, and so it's not just the but-for, it's the but-for and the achievement of that public policy goal. I think you have to be in a place where any abatements are doing both of them.
Right, now we're down.
And there has to be a body in place beyond, you know, the current mayor's administration or the next one to measure the achievement, you know, over time.
Yeah, I think this is really important in that, I said this to finance earlier today. My brilliant guy who works for Louisiana Department of Transportation, who is their commissioner of administration, he says the useful life of an asset to an elected official is exactly coterminous with their time in office. There are no 30-year assets to elected officials, right? And so because the most expensive...
We do have some rare exceptions here in Nashville. I'm thinking of two in particular.
And the most expensive addiction in all of government is cutting of ribbons. And no one gets to cut a ribbon on the replacement of capital assets. No one goes to the pipe replacement for a ribbon cut.
I don't know, I think some people would really be excited about it.
So all of that is to say, there's some
engineers.
generalizations, and obviously, great public servants from an elected position, you know, asked me to be here, and I'm thrilled to have this kind of a conversation. Again, I think you're having this conversation from a place of strength. I think as you look at some of these communities that have struggled with this, it's because they didn't have this conversation and do this work at a point where they were healthy enough to make the changes to continue to be healthy. So I think you're at the right financial point to be having these kinds of discussions about reserves and about what are we actually incentivizing to get back? What are we paying for? What are we buying with these increments, incentives, abatements, and credits?
Gotcha. So, well, this is like drinking from a fire hose. A lot of great information, I think.
Fire hose has Kool-Aid in it, and it tastes
What?
pretty good.
Yeah. Well, what I've heard is, we haven't made any recommendations that were bad recommendations, and what we've done already.
No, I
Yes.
think you could add on to some of them, and I think,
You don't think the TOD was just kind of like their own? That's what I got from your,
What?
that's what you're like, and then TOD. The
Transit.
transit oriented, you
the
said there was kind of like
transit-oriented,
a
it was
last.
interesting.
We had a bunch of voices.
Yeah, no, and when I said it that way, it was like, we really wanna be disciplined, we really wanna be good, we really wanna be better, but God, this looks nice. Like, it read like that. And it was more that, that's why I said it the way I said it. Yeah, it was like my 12-year-old asking for something on December 26th. Well, yeah, but that was yesterday, and this is what I want today, so, yeah.
But transit is a very high priority, and our hopes are that that can be a way, as you've said, both to achieve, you know, some transit, infrastructure, but also to pair it with housing affordability and other things, which is important to this community to ensure that those go together.
This is a part of this discussion. Some of my favorite public facility developments that I've seen over the past couple of years are places where they did a yes and. So the city wanted to do 2 new libraries, and they had $12 million budgeted for each of the libraries, and they went to the development community and said, we'd like to do a library. Here's our lot to do the library. What could you do to develop a building that had a library in it, right? And so there's a couple places in Chicago where they have housing developments that have libraries in the corner.
Nice.
And what the city gave over was the land and the 12 million, and that got put into instead of doing an increment or abatement.
Interesting.
Atlanta, as an example, has a fire station downtown that had no air rights. And so if you go to the fire chief and say, you want a new fire station? Chief says yes every time. Doesn't ask what's above it, doesn't ask what's behind it, doesn't ask what's around it, right? And so, I'm not saying everyone wants to live above a fire station, but if you could do housing above, if you could do housing beyond, if you could do housing beyond with the library or with the fire station, with, so there's another, you know, in Salt Lake, they're doing that with, senior centers, you know, so day centers for seniors, which, much like libraries, what is it? In fact, maybe it's a help to have it attached to some life, and then you get some density out of it, and the city's just putting in, they don't have to run the capital, they don't have to run, they're just putting $12 million into the capital stack of the project. It's a different way to think about it.
And we are very close to being through with our metro property inventory that will enable us to do that, so that one's in the works. Let's talk a little bit about next steps then, and hopefully you can help us think through that. I would love to get this in front of the council before we get too deep into budget season, if that's possible. And I feel like, I think what's left is, to talk a little bit further about this mutual benefit board, I guess is what we called it.
Jurisdictional.
And maybe to put a little bit more emphasis on the single database, which could be, both the place to find out what's out there in terms of transparency, but also to have the annual reporting pieces of it. We've got to do a little bit of figuring out of who's responsible for all that if we can't talk Josh into doing every bit of it?
Say no, Josh.
Does not have the
Say no.
capacity.
My boss would take it on.
That's right, yeah,
And she-
that's right.
She would take it on.
We'll give it to the trustee, 'cause
Trustee
Erica,
Gilmore.
yeah.
But I think the unified language
Yeah.
I think the
Take some
unified
of it.
language is great.
right.
and a process to go back and look at your current
At least a
deals.
report.
Can I ask a question
Okay.
about that?
Agreements.
When we have different sort of tax abating entities that are trying to serve different purposes and have different goals and sort of different programs, it seems to me having some degree of shared language makes a ton of sense. But I also wonder, you get those documents and they've got like 600, words about something that's totally irrelevant or something else that ends up slowing things down and complicating things a little bit and having very purpose-driven programs that are, we're going to meet this particular end, whether it's daycares or affordable housing or whatever it is. And to some degree, that specificity can be and distinctiveness, I could imagine being a feature rather than a bug. And I just want to, that's something that's been bouncing around in my head in terms of like, if we're trying to do this over here, so we talk about it in this way, we're going to try and do something totally different over here with the IDB or what have you. And the council has approved both activities. Everyone sort of signed on. Is there, sometimes when you mash too many things together, it gets blunter and sort of maybe less good about what it does. And I don't know what your thoughts are
I
about
think
that.
that's an excellent.
Well, go ahead. I was just thinking, couldn't we have that uniform language and then also have an addendum, I guess, or an additional document that describes or that pertains to that particular development?
Or the uniform language is just a small piece of it.
Small piece. It's like the initial template, and then, but really that macro board, or I should say mutual benefit board, would be to review at a macro level the process and how it relates to the overall cap, too. That's really, I feel like it is to say, what can we do at a micro level in terms of unifying and maybe goals, but I think that
And I think it's getting.
it's more
from my-
macro based is what I thought.
From my place, it's getting signed off on. We're gonna get really tight on our increments, like we're gonna have good work done, and we're gonna use, Bob was saying that, like, you use these groups to come back with the increment, we're gonna live with that increment, and then the standards and the language are what we're gonna evaluate and how we're gonna evaluate that, and then the group that's doing the micro is the evaluation pieces of it. I think if you get to that place where those are the recommendations you want, and because you guys, I don't mean to say that, because the board holds a lot of the sticks, I think the carrots are there to say, we're inclined to support these projects, but we're only gonna support them under these standards. So it's a little bit like a budget process or a procurement process or a purchasing, like, if you bring it back to us and it's not, we told you this is what we're looking for and this is not what it is. So we have the willingness and the fortitude to say, no, we're not doing that because it doesn't conform. Not because we're being performative, we're trying to get right by what we need for the revenues for this city. Easier said than done, I know. This is a very easy thing for a guy who's gonna be in town for another 16 hours to say something.
So, sorry, again, I don't mean to ask these, like, really drawn questions, but, so this board, is it typically, I don't know if anybody does this board, this fictitious board, as we're making up, everyone is IDB, it's not another board you have to go through, right? Because then you're just adding layer upon layer, but they are saying, hey, in charge of running the overall cap of what is being given holistically, and or if John's asking for this or the IDB, there is a comparative process, or at least going through at some higher level, and then best practices being taken to each of them and cross-referenced. It's just first steps talking to one another, sharing
Yeah.
data.
So that maybe.
But
there's
it's
a
not another board
representative.
you go through. It is purely like more of a governance and helping hand.
One place for council to come
Yeah,
for
okay.
information and guidance.
right.
Just want to make sure
All
everybody.
And then
solve
I
that
think
way.
to your process, if that set of standards is developed, then council has that to hold when, so that, that's what we're holding things up to when they're given to us to.
So they would be responsible for an annual report holistically with this, or would it be the trustee? I'm just trying to figure out what the board does outside of sharing information with one another, right? Like, what is the goal of the board to meet? And I think maybe that's something we need to put our head around.
I mean, I
Like,
think-
if we're gonna recommend this, like, what are they doing?
If it's performative, it's a waste of everybody's time.
Right, right.
So if they're not coming back and looking at what, I mean, yes, they all do different things. Are those the things you want them to be doing? I would ask the question, and if right now IDB can do a TIF in any part of the city for any reason, I would say that shouldn't continue to be the case. I mean, from this macro board, that this is a place and a way for the people that have the sticks to say,
Cut to the chase.
State allows it, so.
you guys are the Nashville.
Is it the mayor?
Yeah.
Margaret and I were chit-chatting earlier. I think you're right. Just as a matter of state law, we wouldn't be able to install a board that had another level of saying yes or no over MDHA or IDB. So they can't, it couldn't be go another place to get approval. A
But
place.
all of those come before the council.
They do come before the council, although, as you know, the council it's not, to
Not a
our
monolith.
guest's point, like, we can call it a 30-year deal, but it's usually a, 2-month to 3-year and 10-month deal, because of reelection. I mean, that's just the practical reality. So, like, gathering information about trying to have one-stop shopping for the transparency, I think that's a legitimate thing, because we don't have anybody that does that. And realistically, only finance has access to all the information to do it, because of the types of different abatements and incentives. And so that's one legitimate goal, and categorizing it into the types of public good that's being purchased with that money, and lumping it. Whether it's, and if sales tax capture zones are included, then the categories are broader, because then it's housing, convention centers, whatever else, the other infrastructure. But I think the committee could do that legally, no problem, without being just performative.
I think having the ability to have a resource that has all this information for all the different bodies, what they do, how they did, and what they have done, and having that as a resource for each entity to go to, and for council to go to, mayor's office to go to, and for them to also put out information, I think is critical. Not necessarily to be, like you said, a governing body, because like you said, you probably won't be able to do that for,
And
definitely not IDB, because they already have so much authority from the state anyway. But there's no one place to get this information.
And
There's
that
no one
seems to me
place
like
to share it, there's no one place to assess it, we don't have
No
it.
evaluation.
Metro
Fishing expedition.
staffing employee kind of position, rather than maybe someone who shows up to a meeting once a month. Like, if you wanna get I think that's probably what we're talking about here, is like a resource person is probably more like an employed expert, either contracted with perhaps, or someone that is probably within the finance department and helping out and sort of is a liaison between this, who reports to council, reports to the mayor. That, to me, if we want this to be a point of information and sharing, that to me is more like a staffing role. I don't know if that's.
Do you think that can live with someone in the mayor's office, but also have a public committee or board where people can show up and give input, or multiple facets be represented? Because the goal is just to get people to talk in some continuity, potentially, maybe not, between IDB, MDHA, if we are gonna look to achieve common civic goals, and where they intersect, right? Maybe there is a greater assessment, because if the people are applying, it's just a place that people are talking, because I don't think that's happening. So, of course, the mayor's office would need to be represented, but I don't know, maybe there is, I don't know if it's a committee, a board, I don't honestly know the semantics or the, the logistics of it, but having a regular meeting between agencies that are administering these with finance and maybe someone in the mayor's office, setting up parameters for periodic reviews of policy that's being, and categorizing it and how we've achieved it, just like you said, putting some bumper blocks and then meeting regularly to assess if we are in achieving that.
I mean, I think that between the different agencies, being given a standard report that needs to be filed annually that's on a website checks that box to some degree. I mean, and I think there's some things that legal is gonna have to do in terms of the standardized language, there's something that's finance is gonna have to do in terms of pulling all these numbers together, and the trustee's office has been willing to help provide the home for it, which I think is gonna dump some responsibilities on y'all that you didn't kind of did, so there they are. And I think what we need to give to the council is not, every single detail of how this works, but at least enough of a recommendation to the council to say, this needs to happen, the council needs to fund one position somewhere to make it happen, or something, and then,
Should it be a council committee, or are we too worried
no, it
about
shouldn't be
their
a council
short?
committee, I don't
Okay.
think.
What if there was a board, committee, commission, whatever you wanna call it, that has, a representative from each one of these other entities on the board, representative from the mayor's office, representative from the council, on the board, it's staffed by ECD in the mayor's office, or the chief development officer staffs it. And, they meet, they monitor, they advise the boards. It would be nice, going to your point, for all of the boards to hear what's going on with other boards, and this one representative can share that information with everybody.
Is there an entity that exists without creating a whole new board, but just a convening of something or others? I mean, do we have to create a whole new board to make this? I mean, I think that's exactly what we need, but
I think it could be a recommendation from this board, this committee, to the mayor's office to create it within their, within their office, and it's staffed by the ECD director, and it, they convene all these other people, and the other boards decide who's going to go to that convening.
And to that point, now that we've heard from the expert that there's not another system on this to emulate,
we're gonna create it.
the truth is, whatever this committee does, before the next month is over, I'm gonna get with finance and start gathering the information for my own purposes, because inevitably, to Charles Roberts' point, with market conditions, the idea of there being no TIF recommended over the next 4 years is probably very low. And before just with the positions I've stated in the past, before I can walk in the Metro Council, I would need to be able to show some data about why it's something that is reasonable or not for the purposes of whatever it is. And so even absent action, I'm going to, after hearing about there isn't a model, start working with finance to gather the information historically, just to get some sense of that chart that you showed earlier that I made up off the top of my head last summer, like to try to do that for real.
Yeah.
But I think that's good, and I think the pairing with that has to be from a master plan from council saying, and this is what we want to see as those priorities. I mean, so I think the other thing from council is getting clear, because you don't want that board to come to a place where it's just well, they're not doing what we said, because it doesn't have real power. I mean, you don't have usufruct over these other agencies, but you want, as the entity that has the sticks, the carrots are, we're gonna be very excited to see projects that meet these public policy objectives. You bring us back something that's job creation, the things that you said we used to do that we don't need to do anymore, we're gonna say no. That we need to have projects that are doing what we're buying, the services for the city that we need.
Yeah.
So I think also being clear up front to this, to say, go down the path you wanna go, but this is what the council is looking for in terms of these projects.
And we also can't, I mean, our work here, I mean, we can't boil the ocean, right? I mean, we can't fix it all. It felt like under Bob's leadership 5 years ago, we took a big step forward of kind of cleaning up and updating the, kind of just general policies around TIF about how it's used, how it's utilized, how much is used, how much is utilized. And part of the goal in that was to restore confidence in TIF and kind of so people better understood what it was, so that the next time we did something, we could point back to it and say, well, it did comply kind of with what we're doing. And it feels like now 5 years later, we're getting ready to take another big step that's around, visibility, transparency, reporting, and accountability. And this working group or committee.
In alignment.
Yeah, in alignment, yeah. And it feels like of the draft report and recommendations, this is the only thing, we're headed to kind of add something to that, but also to shape that committee around. And this committee is also going to help make sure that all of that happens. And I don't know that we have to get there tonight. It feels like we've got at least one more meeting in us. But it feels like that ought to be the agenda item for the next meeting, which is how do we land that plane around that shared.
Yeah.
And I think what Bob's talking about with that capturing of the full increment out across the years that it's committed and seeing that implication, you're in budget season, and that needs to be married with what the city actually needs to do, the work of the city. And so I think bringing those two in alignment is also timely as you're looking at what it's gonna take to run this city for the next decade and the revenues that are gonna be required, making sure that there's a revenue. Because if you're gonna start doing them again and they're gonna be big, then having a full understanding of what that capacity is. And again, I wish I could hand you that, and now that you've been all the way through, this is actually what you should be doing. Like there ain't, of anything I can tell you, there's nothing like that. It has to work for you. And I think you're in a position where there's so many things that are going right here, and you're in a healthy enough economic position that the money that has been flowing through Nashville has solved a lot of these problems for you, and you're fortunate in that regard, because there are other jurisdictions and municipalities that don't have that luxury. So you're in a healthy place to be doing this, but it's important to do it. And I think this alignment work is part of being as mature as you are in this development community, turning for incentives. And you got some tough conversations ahead of you. I mean, all of you do. I've heard some of the things that are on you make no small plans. They do not have the magic to stir men's blood, is what Daniel Burnham put on the master plan of City of Chicago after the fire. You're making no small plans, but these are the things that then take a lot of resources and a lot of wind out of a lot of sails, and you put them in eggs in one basket, for one last metaphor. And so just make sure they're the right basket.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I'm
You're
gonna make a
welcome.
couple
Yes,
homework
thank you.
assignments, and then can we meet same at our regular time a month from now? Is this our regular time? I've lost track of which Wednesday it's supposed to be.
5:30.
Yeah, we can go back to 5:30. 5 to 6:30. 5:30 was easier for people to get here. Yeah, let's go back to 5:30.
Yeah, I think 5:30.
4 Wednesdays now, first Wednesday in.
Unless we want to meet during the day, which is my preference. But
That's right, it's easier. And then, okay, if somebody would be looking at a calendar and tell me what that date ought to be, then I will do that. I'm wondering, Mick, since you raised the question, if you'd be willing to get with Josh and LaTanya and possibly look at some.
Can I talk to Latanya?
Huh?
We cannot talk.
You can talk.
Can we talk
Yes.
outside of the meeting?
Yeah, all right, Marie, you tell me. I would like for them to, all right, maybe each of them talk to Josh.
It's probably to talk to me.
Talk to Josh.
We're gonna talk together.
About, thank you for pointing that out, the legal language that's currently in IDB, LIHTC pilot, and HEB.
Mixed
And,
income?
yeah, and let's just see, oh, look, these 3 paragraphs are the one common thing in all of them, and that would be easy. We don't have to get that solved,
Okay.
but if y'all
Okay.
would,
I'll talk to you.
y'all be willing to do that.
Yeah.
That sound, and then, I will continue to work on that chart, Bob. I've been trying to pull other numbers in. I've filled in some, but it's not done yet, so I'll keep working on that one. And then, Angel, if you wanna go back and ensure that the section about the transparency database has all the stuff in the appendix. Let's make sure Margaret's got all that, and Margaret, you'll continue to be the gatherer of the drafts for the document. And then I will try to articulate, and I may send it to you, Fiona, because you did a good job the last time.
I'm happy to admit.
To articulate what we've come up here as the final recommendation on that. I have taken notes, which I'll send out as minutes. People can add to that as well.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Bob, I would like for us to be as helpful as we can. And I feel like we're getting a lot closer to what's going to be most helpful for the city. There is this very large thing that's happening nearby to us right now, and trying to think through navigating that amongst all of the other things the city does. Is there anything else that we should be thinking about or contemplating in advance of our next meeting? And I'll actually address everybody in the audience.
I think the 2 things I mentioned before are the things that are most on my mind. Like making sure that the recommendations include a full list of that the city compile a full list of every version of abatement, pilot, TIF, free money for tree, whatever this, like all the ways that money makes it not into the budget, buying stuff without being through the operating budget. And also trying to push back as many years as possible for a complete set of numbers for those, so we can at least see trends on a 5, 8, 10-year time horizon.
I mean, the current one starts at 2006. Do we need to go farther back than that, do you think? There wasn't much there then.
I mean, it's, the way I keep thinking it is pushing it back as far as we can push it back. But once it starts being incomplete, then it stops being helpful. And I know from experience, trying to figure out what the TIF number was, 13 years ago is borderline. It's difficult to figure that out. Somewhere around 2015 or 2016, we started collecting a note in the annual audit about a bunch of different tax abatements. And so from about 2016, there's a note in the annual audit that has a lot of it.
Right.
So as far back as we can go, just to see trends. And I do think professionalizing the quote-unquote underwriting, so we are not sort of thumb in the air about about the but-for test.
Yeah, and just on this point, I'd be happy for us to put forth a suggestion to be included in the report. It's not something we have right now. The engagement of experts for underwriting these long-term tax incentive deals, I think is in some places they may have that capacity in-house, some places they may not, but.
And then the only other thing that comes to mind through this meeting is Charles Roberts' point about these things, the things we want to buy with this money as a city, do shift. And I do feel like one of the reasons why TIF started getting really unpopular toward the end of Mayor Dean's years is that we were still executing on a 15-year-old game plan without updating what we were trying to buy with those resources.
Absolutely.
And it absolutely could be that his point that as much as for the last 3 or 4 years it's been housing, that with market forces right now, it could be that it's 1999 all over again, and infrastructure is the thing that we have to provide if we want development to keep going. And so I'm not saying that as a statement, I say that as
Downtown office buildings.
as a question.
Like, who would have thought that
Right.
5 years ago, that would potentially be a problem, right?
So the idea of, that you all have talked about, I'm drawn to about making sure there's frequent discussion and examination about what it is we're trying to buy with the go-forward purchases. That
I think that's the kind of stuff, the non-binding, I mean, that mutual benefit committee, that's exactly the kinds of things that
Committee,
should
that's
be
what
discussed there.
Okay, cool. I think I got it.
Anything else as we
Charles,
go
I
to our
didn't
close?
volunteer you for anything. Do you?
I like the assignments. I think it worked out perfect.
All right, he's available for anybody that needs to just go through Mark. Okay.
If you wanted a day late and have to remind me twice.
You're the man, okay. Thank you. All right, well, thanks everybody for coming. There are 2 cookies left for anybody that needs food
What
because we
day
stayed
are
till
we doing?
7.
I don't think we,
13th.
27th is
27th.
what it comes to.
oh, okay, we're gonna do the last.
Yeah, it's a,
Does
so
that
it's a
work? March
non-council
27th?
meeting week, I think.
Oh, rats.
Are you getting married then? Okay. March 27, or is there another Wednesday that would work
It
better?
is the lead in to Easter weekend. I don't know if Wednesday counts.
Well, we could go to the 20th or into April. Any preference?
Just a quick reminder, the report to council is due before the end of April.
I think we should go with the 20th.
20th.
We could do another extension resolution.
Let's hit this target.
Yeah. I agree.
Time to land the plane.
Let's, yep,
Yeah.
let's hit it.
5:30, 20th?
The 20th, you said, or 27th? 20th?
20th, yeah.
Councilmember Parker, I believe, is gonna be holding an East Bank work session on the 20th,
Okay.
27th.
if that
Back to
matters to you,
27th.
Councilmember.
All right, let's go with the 27th. However, let's,
Someone can bring you something for Monday, Thursday Eve.
I'm good.
all right.
Okay, Wednesday, I think they refer to it.
Okay, Wednesday's already done. 5:30, is there decided that was easier to get here after work? Okay.
Give you cover. You
I
grown.
know, right?
Should we just work till we're done?
We'll work till we're done.
Just to throw it out there?
Yeah, let's,
30, 45 minutes?
Yeah,
good.
if that.
I'll send out for pizza. Okay, any other thoughts, questions, comments? This has been very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wanted to know. We are adjourned.